here. Now, my next guest, he's an accountant, so he'll have a grasp of these numbers, I'm sure. Please welcome into the show Dan Geltrude. Dan, the one that got me, I see these kinds of things every now and again, is that if you would have spent $1 million every day since the birth of Jesus Christ, you would not have spent $1 trillion yet. That's amazing.
Well, you know what it is about the national debt? I say this all the time. It's not really understood because the number is simply too big. You can't even, it's just so large, it's not fathomable. So because of that, people don't really get how serious this matter is. Now, you brought up the point before. The debt is not going to stop growing no matter who wins the next election or the next election or the next election until it's too late. And the reason for that is, Scott, is because American politicians are absolutely addicted to spending. Why? Because the spending buys votes. You know, and you know how the old cliche goes, right? Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Look at the old Soviet Union. Basically, they spent themselves into bankruptcy and the whole thing collapsed. Well, now the Soviet Union collapsing and the United States collapsing financially are two completely separate things because the U.S. debt is actually a global threat. And if the U.S. basically went bankrupt, it would have a meltdown of the entire financial system throughout the world. So this is serious stuff, Scott.
And nobody talks about it because it's unelectable. I get it. You can't go to Washington and say, I'm going to stop spending this, take away that entitlement. But we're going to have to do a little bit of both. Stop spending as much and take away some entitlements. That's just the bottom line. And we've talked about Social Security, you and I, for other stuff a while back. But we're getting to the point where, number one, the interest on that $35 trillion will be the biggest line item in our budget on an annual basis. And we're already $2 trillion behind every year going for the next 5 or 6 years. I think that's what the budget forecast is. And so we're going to be to the point very, very close, if we're not already there yet, that we're going to be printing money to pay interest. That is a death spiral.
It certainly is. And, you know, you look at this, Scott, and you say, well, who's to blame here? So the easy fallback is to say, well, you got to blame the politicians because they're the ones who are spending, right? Spending us into oblivion. And that's true. The other side of this is what we're talking about. A lot of people are aware of this being a problem, but nobody's doing anything. If you look at the issues that people are voting on, Scott, the national debt is nowhere on that list, right?
Never.
Nobody's concerned about it. But if you look at the other things that people are concerned about, I think number one is illegal immigration. Why, or at least some of the reason that they're concerned about that, is because of the cost. So that goes back to we're spending too much. People aren't connecting those dots. So, yes, it's the politicians, but it's also all of us that keep electing people that continue to spend.
You know, I went to a fairly liberal school. There was every year they would do protests about how much we're spending as a country on our defense, right? They were anti-defense spending, anti-military spending. And I think that line item now in our budget annually is something like $860 billion, $870 billion. Next year, I think we're going to be over $1 trillion in interest expense. Now, so are they having protests at the University of Colorado because of the $1 trillion interest expense or the $870 billion military expense? They're not getting their heads around this issue. And you're right, it's because it's too big. It's trying to fathom space, right? They just don't understand. But it will be ultimately could be the undoing of us. You got about 20 seconds. What do you think?
Yeah, Scott, you're 100% right. Unless we start to see things straight and comprehend this, we are in a death spiral, and I don't see anybody that's going to rescue us at this point.
Right, because it's just like you can't talk about it, right? And you can't talk about really Social Security either because, you know, we're owed that, right? It's our money. Well, you know what? It's not there. That's the problem. All right. Anyway, thank you very much for being on the show. That's going to get me